I think we're good to go.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. My name is Leo Liu, and I'm a first-year MPA student at Harvard Kennedy School. I want to start with a few announcements on the Ash Center's behalf. First, the Ash Center would like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people and a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. Would also like to acknowledge and thank the co-sponsors for today's talk. Along with the Ash Center, today's event is co-hosted by the Mousavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government and the HKS China Society, a student organization at Harvard Kennedy School. This talk is being recorded and the video will be posted on the Ash Center YouTube channel. Everyone who signed up for this webinar will receive a link to the video in a follow-up email. You're welcome to submit questions anytime throughout the duration of the event. Please send them via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen instead of submitting them via the chat. With that said, let's get to introducing to our moderator and invite a guest for today's discussion. Today, our distinguished guest here is Lingling Wei. Lingling is a senior China correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and a co-author of Superpower Showdown. She covers China's political economy, focusing on Beijing's policymaking process and its key decision makers. Born and raised in China, she has an MA in journalism from NYU and got her start covering US real estate and finance. Lingling, welcome to Harvard Kennedy School.
Thank you.
Next, I'll introduce the man who, for those of us that study here with an interest in China, he really needs no introduction, Professor Anthony Saich. Professor Saich is the director of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation and a Daweoo Professor of International Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School. He has published widely on the politics and history of contemporary China. Currently, he's working on two projects, an analysis of survey data on citizen satisfaction in China and the recent development of philanthropy and its social consequences. He has just completed a book on the history of the CCP, from rebel to ruler, 100 years of the Chinese Communist Party. Professor, the floor is yours. Please take it away.
Thanks very much, Leo, for those comments. Before we get to today's topics, I would like to make a statement on behalf of the Ash Center, given what happened in Atlanta. I just want to say, as you know, the United States is experiencing a wave of anti-Asian racism and also violence, with reports of verbal and physical attacks at quite an aggressive and gross level. Moreover, sexism and violence against women is all far too common. So the Ash Center joins the calls of the Kennedy School community, condemning all acts of violence, hatred, and discrimination, including those based on gender and ethnicity. We will also share some links for you for some of Harvard's resources about anti-Asian racism in the chat. Now let me please turn to what we're going to be focusing on today. And the question is really, what happens when China's richest man is confronted by the nation's most powerful leader? Well, what it does is it leads to an absolutely riveting, fascinating story where there can only really be one winner. And that's why we're so delighted to have with us Lingling Wei, who, as Leo said, has done tremendous reporting with the Wall Street Journal, and particularly a series of impressive, incisive articles around this particular topic. But the story really opens up to a whole set of other questions, which are really fascinating, that Lingling delves into in her work. It includes things of why did they react so strongly? What is it about the fears in the financial sector that creates this concern? Why have they responded differently to different kinds of organizations? What does it tell us about the relationship between the party and the private sector in China? What does it tell us about the party's view of innovation? What does it mean perhaps globally? So these are just some of the questions that we want to dip into with our discussion today with Lingling. But perhaps Lingling, first, you could just to set the picture for people, because I'm sure many on this session know about Ant and Alibaba, but perhaps not everybody. And perhaps you could just start very briefly by telling us what is Ant Financial, what is Alibaba, and what are the differences?
Sure, absolutely. Very good questions. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you to Tony and Leo for an Ash Center for this invite. I'm of the generation of the Chinese people who always harbored, growing up, harbored the Harvard dream. I've never been to Harvard, but here was my chance. Yeah, yeah, I definitely it's on my to-do list. So here I am talking to all of you, the best and smartest. So I'll definitely try my best to be coherent and sensible. To your question, Tony, yes, when it comes to Jack Ma, his business empire basically consists of these two major companies, Alibaba and Ant. It's really hard to overstate the importance of Alibaba to China's economy these days. Jack Ma founded Alibaba in his apartment in late 90s, basically after a trip to the United States, where he first learned about internet. So he then made a decision, I got to do this in China. I got to bring this idea back to China. So after a few twists and turns, that's basically what he did. He set up Alibaba in his apartment with only a few employees. One of them is his wife. So it's quite a story, right? It's not dissimilar to how Apple was established, by Steve Jobs many years ago. So over the years, Alibaba has evolved from a startup in his apartment into the biggest e-commerce company in China, even in the whole world. Think of Alibaba as the China's version of Amazon. Think of Jack Ma as China's version of Jeff Bezos. So that's basically what Alibaba is. In most recent years, it also has ventured into AI and cloud computing. So the areas that are actually of very significant strategic importance to the Chinese leadership, consider the future for China's growth. So that's Alibaba. And on the other hand, it was formally established only a few years ago in 2014, if my memory serves me right. So 6 years is like a startup of sorts. However, it's not just like a startup. It has become what regulators in China view as a disruptor of sort. Especially to China's financial system. It really involves how Ant does its business. It calls itself as a financial technology company because it has very advanced technology that really enables the company to gather a huge amount of data, consumer data. They know you, they know your spending habits, they know your borrowing habits. So they build up a tremendous database. And so what they do is they use that database as a way to get traditional commercial banks to partner up with Ant. So together, they make loans to either small businesses or consumers. But different, think of as a shadow lender of sort in American terms. However, Ant, different from some traditional types of shadow lenders, Ant doesn't put up too much of its own capital. Most of the funds used to finance the loans come from traditional banks. So, net, that means Ant, acts like a middleman between banks and borrowers, pocketing handsome fees as the middleman. The risks, the credit risks, the risk of defaulting ultimately are shouldered by the banking partners. So in regulators' view, it's, on one hand, it's great, the inclusive finance, right? They're promoting as you all know that in China, state enterprises are still the ones that have an easier time get loans. A lot of private businesses, individuals really don't have that access to financing. So Ant has filled that kind of void, right? But on the other hand, the risks to the financial system in regulators' view, at least, is tremendous because they're growing and leveraging up. I was told 100, they would borrow like $100 for $1 of loan they made. So just keep leveraging up, so becoming this increasing, growing risk to the financial system. So one is Alibaba, very established company, very national champion of sort. The other is Ant, a disruptive sort to the financial system.
That's fantastic. If I may, let's just drill down a little bit more on the last point you were talking about with risk. We know the Chinese leadership has belatedly become aware that perhaps if there is one Achilles heel, if you like, it's within financial risk. Very disconcerted by the 2015 stock market blow up. It didn't start with Jack Ma, of course. We've had Anbang. We had, of course, earlier the somewhat forcible detainment of Xia Jianhua and the unraveling of the Tomorrow Group, where it brought home, I think, to the leadership this kind of cross-fertilizing, working in insurance, working in securities, working in bank, without the center really understanding that, could lead to a terrible unraveling. So I think it's interesting what you were saying there. So is that why Xi Jinping reacted so strongly? Was it because of he and the regulators were so concerned about potential risk because of what you're describing about Ant Financial? But then why Jack Ma and why now?
That's such a brilliant question, and it's really a question where we have been trying to figure out ever since late last year. Based on our reporting, I think it's pretty clear that the crackdown on Jack Ma and Ant really has been driven as much by genuine concerns about financial risks, as by politics. Tony, as you mentioned earlier, this is not the first time a well-known tycoon in China, is basically has fallen from grace or got into severe trouble. You mentioned Xiao Jianhua, you mentioned Wu Xiaohui. I mean, there are also Wang Jianling. There are also many others. So for Jack Ma, we have focused a lot of people have focused a lot on that speech he gave in October last year. During the speech, he just really the usual aggressive, flashy, outspoken style, criticized harshly regulators and Xi's campaign to control financial risks. So, initially, I focused a lot of my reporting on that speech, what exactly that speech did to him. We found out that it did contribute to his, the crackdown. However, as we have done more reporting, another picture that's emerging is that, his problems really have been building up for many years. It's not just, just because the speech and doomed everything. In fact, for many years, financial regulators, especially those at the central bank, they really have wanted to regulate him for a long time. But Jack being Jack, as you know, he's very good at combining his commercial ambitions with his political savvy. One of the interesting issues a lot of people turn to overlook is, the tension, the divergent interests between local authorities and the central government. Jack Ma is very good at, taking advantage of what local authorities want and desired, and using that basically to play, against the center. So for the longest time, he has been very successful. Alibaba has got tremendous support from his hometown, the province of Zhejiang, and the same thing, as our reporting show and IPO, planned IPO, the big promoter for that was both the government of Zhejiang and the government of Shanghai, because Shanghai is building up this NASDAQ style board for tech-oriented stocks. So for a long time, he was very good at handling different pressure points and basically playing local authorities against the center and using that to work in his advantage. However, complaints about that also have been building up. And one other really important factor that contribute to his from grace is really how powerful his business empire has become. Forget about Tomorrow Group, forget about Anbang. They're powerful players in China's capital markets. With Alibaba and with Ant, they actually combine capital, technology, and political backings in certain sense. So they have become this, very pervasive, forceful force across the Chinese society. So that really started to challenge the existing, not just financial orders, but political orders in China. As you all know, under President Xi Jinping, he's really upped the ante in terms of pressure on the private sector. Of course, you need to 听话, right? You need to 讲政治, towing the party lines. But for a company as big as Jack Ma's business empire, that demand is even higher. As Xi Jinping told a group of tech entrepreneurs in late 2018, that meeting, interestingly, Jack Ma was not invited to. Xi Jinping just very blunt message, commercial success, really secondary to beef up in terms of mission of beefing up China's technological development and security. So I think all those reasons combined really helped explain why, the axe really is falling down on Jack Ma right now.
Yeah, I want to drill down a little bit deeper on a couple of those issues in a moment. I just want to point out to you, though, you have an unbelievably global audience. We have Congo, Brussels, all across US, Shanghai, Jakarta, I've seen India, Amsterdam. So you're really speaking globally today. Well, just Philippines popped up as well. So yes, I mean, we always did think of Jack Ma as politically astute. If we think back to 2016, G20, it seemed as though Jack Ma was Xi Jinping's favorite person, sort of pushing forward in that meeting. And yet he makes a speech, which really leads to the pushing things open, allowing the regulators to come in. Let me ask you one point about that speech, though. Do you think he had a point, in the sense that you seem to indicate there is this starving of access to capital for small businesses, for individuals? Maybe he didn't phrase it well, but was he making a valid point in those comments?
Well, absolutely. I think he had a very good point. After his speech, I actually shared the video with some of my colleagues in the US, and they were like, oh my gosh, if he made the speech in New York or Washington, he would have been applauded, because, this is a challenger, right, to the existing system. But that just doesn't work in China. Never really worked, especially today. It doesn't work. Absolutely. I mean, China's inherent problems, structural problems, especially when it comes to access to credit by the private sector, has been long running. And, the government has talked really good talks about, in order broadening their access. But so far, the progress has been very limited. It has a lot to do with the overall structure problems in China's economy. no question, he had a point, but it's not, yes, I think he just misread the scene very badly. I think he probably thought that, like what he did in the past, this is not the first time he took the podium and criticized existing either big banks or regulators. This is not the first time. In the past, he did the same thing, and nothing happened to him. I think this time around, he probably also thought he could have got away with it. And let's not forget that a lot of his investors in Ant are state-backed investors. They're the China's big pension fund, the China's massive sovereign wealth fund, the big insurance companies, and you name it. CICC, the big investment bank, their PE platforms. So he probably thought that with all that state backing, with all the backing from local authorities, again he could got away with it. Little did he know that no, this time not. That one thing we discovered later on as we continued reporting this whole saga was even before that speech, the central government conducted an investigation which really centered on who owns Ant, right? And the finding really was not in his favor. There were a lot of complaints. A lot of people actually complained to various agencies that it's too important a company to be owned by some problematic, what the government views as problematic owners. The Tomorrow Group, the Ambang, they learned, especially people at the central bank, they really learned the lessons about how important the shareholding structure is, especially for a financial holding company. So all those things really, the writing should have been on the wall for him. But I guess another thing, before he made the speech, my sense was he also kind of knew that tighter regulation was coming up, and that would really hurt Ant's valuation after the IPO, right? So that, I guess that was also a contributing factor why he made that speech. However, he is like his last ditch effort to fend off those tight regulations. However, this time it really backfired badly for him.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think he clearly, in retrospect, as you've shown, he misjudged the political winds. And I think he probably tells us broader stories about what is happening in the politics at the center, which I want to come back to in a moment, that the market reformers, in a sense, have been squeezed out in recent years. We had the very dramatic November 2013 assertion that the market is decisive. It looked as though that was the direction China was going to move. But we've seen this reassertion back to control. And I think part of it you answered earlier, where this fragility and weakness seen potentially in the financial center cause nerves in the leadership. And of course, their overriding concern is around stability. Another thing that surprised me has been some of the reactions to Jack Ma. There really has been an outpouring of venom, which I think taps into another aspect of the inequality in China. He's been abused, he's been called all sorts of names online by people. And so in that sense, in a broader public, perhaps, if you want to call it a taking down, perhaps his taking down of Jack Ma may have actually increased regime popularity.
That's such a sharp observation, Tony. That's exactly right. It really surprised me how little sympathy there has been within China, for him. And, maybe because China's media and China's social media still very much heavily censored, probably pro Jack Ma posts got deleted, but still you got a sense that the overwhelming sentiment is, the government is doing the right thing. Even some of my friends, they're very liberal thinking, they're very market oriented, they very much also supportive of government action because they say, you know, he's really benefited from the government policies. And those licenses, those lending license, payment license, it's not everybody who can just apply and get it, right? The very fact that the government has given him all those licenses shows they have shown him tremendous favor. So, you know, you shouldn't forget, you know, the people who helped you succeed. So that's basically the very typical Chinese thinking. They felt like after he has grown so successful and his companies become so big, there's definitely a sense of hubris. You know, the companies also act a little bit more arrogant. They would even engineer social media campaigns if they don't like something. You know, as we just wrote in a recent Page One story, you know, last year, the extramarital affair of a very senior executive at Alibaba, you know, got exposed on social media. What did Alibaba do? You know, they basically deleted all those unflattering posts about that executive and the company. So, you know, things like that have happened many times and definitely got the attention from the top leadership. You know, it's like, you know, we are the one who control public opinions here, not some company. And, you know, really their success is really very much because of government support. So I think really, you really hit the nail to the head. I mean, the way he has acted and his style in America, for sure, he would have many fans. I mean, even, you know, in very recent years, he still had very big following. People really admired his success. But more and more, because of things like what we just talked about, people kind of also, especially among the younger generation, that kind of turned on him. Also, another question is, you know, initially, yes, very innovative, both his companies are, but with the end, what's really the innovation they're asking?
Yeah. Yeah, I want to come back to Alibaba in a moment because the leadership does seem to be treating that differently from Ant Financial. But I'd like to follow on first where you were beginning to go with some of those comments. And that's really about the relationship between the party state and private enterprise. Now, we know historically, the Chinese Communist Party has always had ambivalence, concerns, and often outright hostility towards the private sector. It used it initially after 1949, and then it eradicated it effectively. And then, of course, as reforms started, grudgingly, it let it move forward, and it now acknowledges that private wealth exists. But it is also, I think, in recent times, been made very clear by Xi Jinping, I think following along the lines of what you just said, you know, we made you, you know, you're rich because of us, but the other side of that is you really follow our lead and you follow our policies. So if we could just push a little bit further on what is this telling us about the relationship currently between the party state authorities and the private business sector?
Sure. As you say, Tony, the party traditionally has never been entirely comfortable with the private sector. It has used private entrepreneurs, you know, if they serve the party's purposes. Right after the founding of People's Republic, we saw the cases like Rong Yiren, you know, the best known kind of red capitalist in China. He even was promoted, given this very ceremonious title as vice president of China. So that basically the peak, political peak when it comes to red capitalists. And over the years, we have seen Liu Chuanzhi, you know, the founder of Lenovo. There are times that he also, you know, had problems with the government as his company became bigger. And now we see Jack Ma. So what has really changed under Xi Jinping is the emphasis on loyalty, the emphasis on political correctness. is much stronger. I think, this is like a debate I'm having with a lot of China hands these days. Is I really do feel that of all recent Chinese leaders, Xi Jinping is the most politically driven, ideologically driven than his predecessors. Deng Xiaoping, he, be it white cat or black cat, if you can catch a mice, you're a good cat, right? Very market driven. Jiang Zemin basically carried on, helped China join the WTO. Even Hu Jintao, he also put really economic development first. But under Xi Jinping, economic development no longer trumps politics. It's the other way around. This emphasis on being politically correct is much stronger. So what that means to private entrepreneurs is that, especially in key sectors like technology, new energy, right? New type of the electric vehicle, those sectors that are of importance to the government, they're definitely a heightened focus on private entrepreneurs falling in line with political agenda of the day. So the emphasis is much stronger, I think.
No, I agree with you entirely. I mean, if you look at it from Xi Jinping's perspective, when he took power in 2012, the country looked a mess. We'd just been through a difficult transition phase with Bo Xilai. It looked as if society was out of control, looked like business was out of control. It looked like local governments really were running their own interests rather than the interests of the state. So I think a lot of that sort of centralization drove much of what he was thinking about. And if you take his words at face value, he talks about historical materialism, Marxism, so on, and so forth. And I think we see a phenomenon that has recurred in multiple occasions, and that is, if the state doesn't have the capacity, it outsources. And of course, in the new technology, it didn't have that capacity. So it outsourced to those private entrepreneurs. As you rightly say, now that they've grown so big and powerful, it's sort of reasserting its control. And as you said in your articles, that's, stronger control of party committees, stakes buying in, so on and so forth. And it's a phenomenon we've seen historically over time. I'd like to come back to some of the consequences of perhaps how foreign businesses might think about that. But before we go there, I'd like to come back to Alibaba. And it does seem the state is treating Alibaba distinctly from Ant Financial. You wrote, I think, in one of the pieces about this potential very significant punitive fine. But it doesn't seem to be unwinding in the same way as is occurring with Ant Financial. Why is that?
Sure, that's exactly right. As we discussed earlier, it really speaks to the differences between these two companies. They're both Jack Ma companies, very associated with Jack. But on the other hand, Alibaba is this very, big, significant national champion of sort that can help showcase China's economic and technological rights and can keep, the government really doesn't have any intention to rein it in the way it's reining in Ant. So what they want Alibaba to keep doing is keep innovating, keep be humble, right? It's acted a little bit in too much of an arrogant way for a very long time. Wanted more humble, just more 讲政治, right? So distance itself further from its founder Jack Ma. It just because Alibaba is so important to the party. How many employees Alibaba has? It's like 120,000 employees, and their net income last year was almost $20 billion, nearly the same as the net income made by Amazon You know, as we discussed earlier, is also in AI, is one of the leading AI provider in China, and cloud computing. You know, during the trade war between Trump administration and China, there are many times the Chinese negotiators actually talk to Alibaba about how to maybe can slightly open the cloud computing market a little bit to the Americans without really relinquishing control over the data. So you just can see like the importance, and also obviously Alibaba also owns some media and entertainment assets like the South China Morning Post and the other, and they also own stakes in Weibo, you know, the very popular social media app in China. You know, my colleagues recently reported that, you know, there's a potential that Alibaba will have to divest some of those non-core assets. But it's such a sprawling business empire and very important for China. And you know, it's also a tough balancing act for the party these days, right? On one hand, they want to just make sure that people know who's in charge. On the other hand, they also, you know, innovation is important for the future of China. The global tech race ultimately comes down to talents, right? They don't want to really scare off all those entrepreneurs and aspiring you know, ambitious younger generation. So they still want to make sure that they know they have a future, you know, as long as they adhere to the goal of the party state. So that's why Alibaba is getting, you know, a little bit softer treatment from the government.
No, that's fascinating. And let me again just pick up on the last point that you were beginning to move towards. Sorry, for people who are writing in questions, I'm trying to incorporate them in some of the comments and questions I make. I do have a couple of others which are distinct, which I will come back to. But I suppose one of the concerns is whether this tighter control is going to undermine innovation in the IT sector. As you said, it's such an important part if we think of Made in China 2025, you know, upgrading capacity within China, digital Silk Road, you know, the reach out into the world. So, you know, China seems to emerge very strong domestically, globally in those sectors. So is there a concern that this might undermine innovation in the IT sector?
Definitely, there's a genuine concern, especially when you talk to entrepreneurs. You know, there definitely this kind of concern. The government also realizes that. So, you know, when they, the new generation of China's industrial policy, you know, the focus these days is, you know, trying to get private companies more involved with the state. So in the past, it's just, you know, as you know, various level of government gets funding from the central government, and then they just kind of use the money to dictate what they want to invest. But this time around, at least from the center, they want to make it more driven by the bottom up. So they would invite private companies over and talk this through. And okay, that's a good idea. Here's a big grant, go ahead and do that. So you have seen some policy adjustment that really takes into account the question just made. But on this more relevant question, so what does this crackdown Jack Ma, what kind of example does that set for other Jack Ma's or Jack Ma wannabes in China? You know, I think yes, there are definitely, you know, psychologically, it's definitely a blow, and people would ask, what's the point of being so successful? You know, in the end, you know, you have to give up so much, right? But then it's just because China is still a developing country. This pent up demand for having a better life, for, you know, having building up a successful business, still so huge. And the Chinese culture, you know, Americans are known for not being willing to follow orders, but it's really not the Chinese style, right? No, Tony, you know this I'm sure much more than I do, the difference in terms of cultures. So there definitely are concerns right now about the blow to the so-called morale or, the incentives. But we really haven't seen specific examples that, one entrepreneur just stopped, like quit. Oh, because this is terrible, I'm not going to do it, and then move to America. We haven't seen that, but we know that that is the issue. The government really needs to strike a right balance. You can't just control like that kind of a tight-fisted control, and at the same time expect people still get so motivated. I guess one bigger question is, what does this do to the kind of ecosystem that's needed for innovation, right? Because it's not just entrepreneur drive, personal drive in order to achieve certain breakthroughs in key technology. You also have to have a whole ecosystem that is conducive, that never has been established in China, potentially could get harder.
That's really interesting. I mean, on the question of being role following, I kind of think yes and no. Most people I know in China are really anarchists at heart. And most people, here's a rule, okay, let's work out how we can get around it. So it's a very kind of complex environment. But one person raised the question, if I'm now sitting there running Tencent or a similar organization, should I be worried? Am I next?
I think Pony Ma is fine. The reason being is that, Tencent also is very different from Ant. It's a completely different species. Similar to Alibaba in a way, but it's very, it's more pure tech-oriented firm than much more so than Ant, even Alibaba in certain ways, and it's already very heavily controlled by the government. And another thing is his personal style also is very different from Jack Ma. I mean, that really matters in China too. He's very, he has excelled at 中庸之道, right? This traditional values in Chinese culture means you're always moderate in your remarks and in your actions. Very different from Jack Ma. So in a sense, people waiting to bring him down, much fewer than the people who are waiting to bring Jack Ma down. So I think, and also the latest example, right? Shanghai Securities News is government-owned newspaper, very focused on economic coverage. They recently published a list of business leaders in China. Pony Ma's name still there, Robin Li, right, Lei Jun, but who's not there anymore? Jack Ma. And also the latest legislative sessions, right, that just ended in Beijing. I know, Jack Ma hasn't been a delegate to those sessions for many years, but again, he's not there, but Pony Ma. Last year, he was sick, so he didn't go to Beijing as a delegate, even though he was a delegate, but he didn't go to Beijing because he said he was sick. This time, he again was a delegate, and he went to Beijing, and he made a number of recommendations. So the sign, I mean, covering China in a way, it's like reading tea leaves all the time. So that's the kind of the latest tea leaves, that are there. But it doesn't mean that, he shouldn't be careful. I mean, he already is very careful. Of course, there are certain practices, anti-competitive practices, Tencent also would have to, correct under the orders from the central government. But I'm really not seeing a big chance of Tencent or Pony Ma getting cracked down the way Jack Ma and Ant are now.
I want to come back in a moment to some sort of international consequences of this, but what you were just saying there about reading the tea leaves, I mean, and growing up in a time of criminology and peakinology, One person asked, actually, given this is such a sensitive topic, what were your challenges in doing this kind of reporting? And how could you get done what you did?
Wow, that's a really big question.
Yeah.
That's a question I'm asking myself every day. And as you know, Tony, I'm no longer in China. I'm based in New York now because, as part of the expulsions of American journalists by the Chinese government, tic tac for what the US did to Chinese journalists. The job is getting harder and more challenging. Obviously, I have benefited from the contacts I built up over the past decade where I was actually in China. How long I can keep doing this is really a big question, but I'm just gonna try my damnedest to keep doing this because I just love it so much. And, I really feel like, China is such a amazing story. China is complex. China is, just really difficult to understand, but China is so important to everyone. It's definitely a challenge, and I'm hoping after the pandemic is over, I can still get chances to go back to China at least for family visits. So that could really keep me up to date on, what people on the ground are thinking. And also, trying to really branch out, talk to the broader Chinese community overseas. There are many, many wonderful people who have different views and insights about the Chinese society, about the Chinese system.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's the story of our generation. And most importantly, it's getting the story right. We can be critical of China, but we need to be critical of China on the right things. And so, some of the myths that have been created actually can be quite destructive, I think. Coming back to some of the other questions related to this is Wall Street or some of the financial companies seem to be salivating at the prospect of entering into the financial markets in China. I think that Peking has been very clever with that, in that it clearly sees sort of Wall Street and related companies as being potential allies that might drive a wedge between them and Washington. And we saw very different comments from Jack Ma and, say, some foreign fund managers back at that same event last year, who were much more supportive of the Chinese Communist Party, I would say. But do you think there is a danger or a warning in this for the foreign invested companies trying to move into China, or who are already in China?
I remember it really reminded me of 2015, Tony. You also mentioned it earlier. That was such a significant year, especially for Xi Jinping's rule of China. Before 2015, he was more pro-market, more pro-reform. But 2015, because the stock market crash, the devaluation of the renminbi, it became such a watershed moment. And after that, the control just noticeably, right, strengthened. I remember back then I was in China covering the whole crash. And a lot of foreign managers at the time was trying to get money out of China. So as soon as they made the application, trying to move funds out of China, they got a call next morning and basically having tea with the Chinese regulators. So the message was pretty clear. If you move that big sum of money out, you may have hard time getting greater quotas to invest in China when markets bounce back. So at the time, people just only half jokingly called the Chinese market Hotel California. Right, you can come in, but it's going to be really hard if you want to leave. I still think that kind of description is still somewhat fitting today. no question, China has taken a number of steps to make the financial sector, financial markets more accessible for foreign investors. But I know that within the central bank and other financial regulators, they do worry, if the Chinese financial system can really withstand the kind of flows, cross-border flows of capital. They learned the lesson from the late 90s, the Asian financial crisis. They really learned that lesson. And, the global financial crisis also, is both a sign to China that the Western model is not perfect, can have really big problems, but also is a warning sign that the financial system is the most important, but it's also hardest to control. So, these days, despite all the steps they have taken to liberalize the financial market, you haven't really seen much loosening of the capital account. So what that tells you is they're moving very gingerly, very cautiously in terms of allowing fair flow of capital across the border. So when in the Jack Ma context, obviously another issue is the foreign ownership in his company. Both of his companies have been quite significant. For Alibaba, one of the biggest shareholders is Japanese, the SoftBank, right? Big investor. And for Ant, you have a number, you name it, all the big mutual fund firms in America, BlackRock, Fidelity, you name it. They all have shareholder stakes in Ant. So, but I seriously, I do not think this recent crackdown on his empire and on him personally was driven by concerns about foreign capital. It's probably more domestic holdings. But still, after the sudden shutdown of the IPO, the foreigners got stuck, right? They basically, all that money is basically stuck there. There's no timetable for a resumption of the IPO plan. Because I was just told there's nothing about that on the high level government agenda right now. So you just have to wait. So that just this kind of regulatory uncertainty and lack of transparency, it really is something foreign investors should really think about before putting a lot of money in China's market. But on the other hand, China is just so big, and the interest rate differentials, the yields, it's just really attractive. It's really hard to ignore. So it's a hard balance, especially for someone managing billions of dollars. I really can't imagine how tough a job that is.
Yeah, the question of transparency is interesting, and what you're buying into. I remember, if you look at Chinese ratings agencies, most of the state-owned enterprises are AAAs or AA pluses. Yeah. And I think it was a smart move letting Moody's and one or two others in, because they basically graded these as perhaps double Bs, Cs, minuses. So because of that lack of transparency, you don't know what you're getting into. I know we're running short on time, but a number of people are interested, and I'm also interested in the comparison and similarities and differences with debates about big tech in the USA. I mean, Jeff Bezos is not a universally loved person in the USA. There's similarly been a lot of debates about whether big tech companies in US are controlling too much information. Should they be broken up? Should they be regulated? Do you see any similarities there? And what are important differences in your perspective?
Sure, that's such a great question. Definitely there's a parallel between what's happening in China today and what's happening in Europe and in the US. All countries all over the world are facing this big challenge of how to regulate big data because they're just so powerful and pervasive these days. So I know for a fact that Chinese regulators also have been diligently studying and watching what the US regulators are doing and what the European regulators are doing. One thing that concerns Ant is really what to do with Alipay, the payment platform. right? Should Alipay stay as part of Ant as it being restructured as a financial holding company? Or should Alipay be carved out? Because so many people use Alipay these days, it's like 1 billion users. So some regulators are arguing it's already becoming a public utility of sorts. So, maybe it should just, be separated out and just, be a separate platform. And then that raises questions about, okay, if you do that, what would you do to Tencent WeChat Pay, right? So I think for I have to give Chinese regulators a lot of credit. Those technocrats, they really know their stuff. I mean, they're constrained sometimes, many times by political reasons, but those people, they're very savvy. They really know. They're studying what the US is doing, Europeans are doing. So I think they're trying to come up with more industry-wide, standards or practice, whatever they do to end could also, they realize the implications to the rest of the industry. So they're also moving very cautiously about what to do to that. I would say one big difference is, so the China's government talk about anti-monopolist practice, antitrust laws and all that. And the biggest monopoly in China is what? It's not those private enterprises. It's really the state sector. Yeah. So it's it's really not at the same level playing field. So I think that really even the Chinese know that. Okay, how about the big state-owned telecoms, the big state banks? Government has talked about breaking up the state bank monopoly for many years. And so what happened? They got stronger. So I think that's the biggest difference. But all of the countries face the issue how to balance, effective regulation against the need to keep innovation going and keep foster newcomers to the market. Another thing I would just want to quickly add is one thing that the Chinese leadership has learned from Western economies, especially in the US, that they do not want to be kidnapped by big corporate interests. They felt like in the US, big corporations are so powerful. And in a way, really, the big donors to elections and different parties, the leaders in China felt like, that really is the reason why the US is having so many problems these days. So Beijing definitely has every intention to avoid that. So that also speaks to the current crackdown on the tech sphere, especially on Jack Ma.
Mm-hmm. A number of people had the question, but you've sort of answered it. They wanted to know, is the anti-PO going to happen? And the answer was clearly, we don't know. But I'm afraid we're at the bewitching hour. I just want to thank you, Lingling, for fascinating conversation. I think it was really instructive. I think I learned a lot, and I hope those who've been viewing learned a lot. And we hope we're going to see you up here in person, or that we'll be able to interact with you again in the not too distant future. So thank you very much. And thank you for everybody who tuned in, who raised questions, who raised chats. I saw they were going at a furious pace. And so thank you once again, Lingling.
Thank you very much. It's my honor. I cannot wait to get out of here and go do some traveling and go see you guys in person.
Thank you.
Thank you.